This is our community conversation about police violence and how we can create change. This year, Repair the World Pittsburgh, One Hood Media, and World Affairs Council are coming together to host a series of community conversations addressing the intersections of how white supremacy, xenophobia, racism, anti Semitism, homophobia, and related issues are affecting our community, and tools and language to support learning and addressing injustice. Every day, police violence results in deaths, serious injuries, and mental abuse for populations in the US and around the world. Around 1,000 people are killed every year in the United States by police, and in 2020, Black people made up 28% of this number, despite being only 13% of the United States population. These violations are often fueled by deficient laws, racial and class discrimination, and entrenched impunity for police forces. We will be joined by multiple panelists with unique perspectives on this issue. Dustin Gibson, a disability justice activist and founder of the Pittsburgh Without Police Fund, will focus on policing in the larger context of imperialism. Onyinye Gandhi Chuks, an activist and lawyer who leads the Association of Nigerians in Pittsburgh, will provide a global lens centered on SARS and the realities on the ground in Nigeria. Ada Perlman, a student at the Ellis School in Pittsburgh, will be speaking on her connection to the October 27th, 2018 synagogue shooting that impacted the three congregations worshiping there, Dor Hadash, Tree of Life, and New Light, in response to police action and bias and who they protect. Join us to learn more about how police violence affects people in the United States and around the world, how we can hold police officers accountable, and the different ways people are working to find solutions to this problem. The conversation will be moderated by Ashley Comans from the Alliance for Police Accountability. The ASL interpreters providing communication access for tonight's community conversation is Catherine and Dan. After Catherine transplanted from upstate New York, she has been working as an educational interpreter in Pittsburgh for 15 years. She is also passionate about and prioritizes communication access to both social justice and food access conversations. Dan has been in the field for many decades and has always savored the opportunity in his myriad of experiences to learn, connect, and interact with folks from all walks and stages of life. Together, it is their honor and privilege to provide communication access for tonight's community conversation. Thank you, Catherine and Dan.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Ashley Comans. I'm really excited about this conversation that we're going to have this evening. And so I'm not going to take too long, really. We had a great introduction from Brittany, so thank you so much for the words that she was able to share. For us to just get started, I really want to allow each of our panelists to kind of be able to give their own perspectives of where they see policing when it comes to reform, reconstruction, or the abolition of policing, and what that looks like, and what are your different ideas to eradicate police or police violence. So if each of you could just share your thoughts on that.
All right, if I may, Onyinye Gandhi Chuks here, activist and lawyer. I practiced law in Nigeria for some years before I came over here to the United States. I've followed the trajectory of police violence in the developing world for quite some time, both academically and practically as an activist. So this gives me, I believe, the ability to make comparisons between what obtains here in the US and what obtains in other parts of the world. So the question is, can reforms work? Or do you abolish the police? Now, I think to answer that question, it's important to x-ray the history of police forces in every society, how they came about in the first place and what their actual roles are. And this is irrespective of moderations or constitutional adjustments to those roles. In Nigeria, for example, the Nigerian police force, it was eventually changed to just the Nigerian police, but the Nigerian police force was established by the British colonial authority. And it was set up as an agency to essentially compel the colonized population to basically become compliant to British economic interests. Now, in putting together the structure of that police force, the interests, the security, the protection of the Nigerian people was the least concern of the British colonialists. And you see that pattern across Africa and the rest of the developing world. Here in the United States, a similar story. A lot of the police departments started as slave catchers. The idea wasn't really to protect populations, but essentially to serve the interests of controlling elements within society. Now, while it is true that these forces evolved to now play a slightly different role as society developed, they cannot escape the weight of their history. And it is the case that the training manual, the training philosophy, all right, of most of these departments, whether in Nigeria or here in the United States, is inextricably tied to their history. All right. Now, in Nigeria, when the police is trained, civil engagement with the civilian population is not the primary consideration. Brutal suppression of crime or criminals, allegedly, is the focus. Now, if you teach them to brutally suppress, and as a lawyer, I understand how it is couched, the use of reasonable force. Sometimes reasonable force, the police officer is given the discretion to determine what is reasonable, all right? So now, but if you say the person has all these powers, to suppress crime and suppress the criminal, but you do not pay enough attention on the dynamics of the relationship between the police officer and the civilian, who might be misconstrued as a criminal, then you're going to have a problem. So that brings me to the question of, can reforms work? The police force or police departments are an extension of the society itself. So if you're going to reform or change police departments, you've got to look at the foundational factors in those societies which influence the behaviors of the police officers themselves. Here in the United States, for example, I've been appalled to observe over the past couple of days that a lot of the people who breached the US Capitol to carry out a massively partisan political protest, were police officers. Now, it is not that they are prevented from having political opinions, but if a trained police officer who is supposedly expected to protect people of all colors, of all political persuasions in their community, could go into the Capitol, see what happened on that day, defend what happened, participate in what happened, attack other police officers, then you have to now go back to try and understand why that officer, regardless of their police training, behaved that way as an individual from personal factor. And that's why the economic, political, and sometimes social problems within society are largely responsible for the formation of these individuals who then go ahead or who then go along to join these police departments and manifest their behaviors within society. So if you're going to reform these police departments, you have to fundamentally restructure society. It is that social re-engineering that we should be talking about, because the police departments are only going to be a reflection of the larger society that they represent. If the society is racist, the departments will be racist.
Hi, I'm Ada. I'm a junior in high school, and I guess adding on to that, I would say I've grown up in Pittsburgh for most of my life, and it's a pretty segregated city, so I guess I've kind of witnessed and seen how police respond or don't respond to different situations and kind of how bias plays into all of that. And I would agree that I think policing has become kind of very politicized, and police have become this political prop, as we all saw last week at the Capitol. And I think for reform to be possible, like policing cannot be politicized because they are supposed to protect everyone equally. And like, I'm very grateful in my own life when police have helped my family or my community. And so I definitely think that police are helpful to our society, but not helpful to everyone in our society. And that's where bias comes in. And that's where I think reform can only be possible if police have anti-bias training, which obviously is not enough. And there's all these other layers like politics that go into that.
Hey, this is Dustin. For the interpreter, sign name just DG above my shoulder and then across my chest under my beard. I'm a light-skinned Black person with a beard. I have a St. Louis cap on and I have a black sweatshirt on. In thinking about just like even the framing of this conversation, I think the idea that police violence or we have police brutality is redundant. I'm viewing brutality and violence is a function or feature of policing. It's not a bug. It's a requirement in order for policing to happen in the way it does. As far as reform, I think reform of police is absolutely something that we can accomplish because we have accomplished it. The entire project of policing has been one of reform from its inception. And the same goes with jails and prisons and other tentacles of the carceral system, if you will. Right now, what we have is a situation where the state has a monopoly on the violence. So to think about the reforms that become popular, usually they are to expand the apparatus of the state, of the prisons, of the police themselves. After the Ferguson uprisings in 2014, one of the main reforms pushed on local levels, it was pushed in Pittsburgh as well as through the Obama administration, was body cameras. What that did ultimately was give funding to police departments on the local level to implement body cams. When we know the body cams don't provide us any level of justice, right? We still see that less than a percentage of the officers that have murdered somebody are charged with the murder, right? Or charged with any crime at that. And then even a smaller percentage is actually convicted. And even if we're convicting them at high rates, we're also legitimizing the system of prisons that we have right now by saying that that is doing something to repair harm, right? Prisons almost remove the possibility of accountability. They remove the ability to actually rehabilitate. They're not designed to be a place, in name, they say correctional facility, in name, they say rehabilitation center at times. But the design of it itself is one of deprivation. It's deprivation of touch, deprivation of access to healthy food, it's deprivation of language, all of the things that create and perpetuate harm. Also, if we're going to put officers that have murdered somebody in prisons, in jails, that doesn't mean that they're not able to continue to harm people in prisons and jails as well. So I guess what I'm offering and what has been offered to me through a lineage of people throughout our history, specifically Black people and Black feminists, is the idea of abolition is the only way forward, and not just reducing the amount of state violence in which people are experiencing, but the amount of interpersonal violence as well. As Angela Davis says, prisons don't disappear people, they don't disappear problems, they disappear people. And what we do with the police, what we do with prisons is outsourcing ways of resolving conflict, outsourcing ways of mitigating harm. Those are tools that a lot of us have. Those are tools that we could teach each other and learn from each other on how to actually implement in our neighborhoods. But I guess one of the overarching things is that we have tried the police and we have tried prisons and it hasn't worked. And any offer that says that we should continue to do that and we should put more resources and more time and more energy is one that I feel like lacks creativity, and it also lacks a vision for what we actually deserve, right? Do we deserve to have tanks going through Homewood, right? The police, the Pittsburgh police don't call them tanks, but they have small like holes on the side where you can put an assault rifle through it and shoot out on a neighborhood block, right? They have robots that go into a house so they don't have to go into equipped with bombs. They have surveillance apparatus that can tell if a shot has been fired in the neighborhood. So there's all this type of equipment and militarization that comes along with policing how we do it. And I don't think that that's something that we deserve as people, right?
Yes, thank you, Dustin. This is Ashley speaking. Kind of with that conversation, I appreciate where you made the point of, yes, reform can happen, because in a way we're seeing some sort of reform. Oni, I believe you kind of mentioned this as well when you were speaking. So with working with what we have, in a sense of, we have state legislatures, we have places where new policies and laws can be created. What is our responsibility as folks who are working within the movement to ensure that we have legislators who are going to push the policies that can make a change, like a database of police officers who have a history of doing things that are abusing their power? We consistently see those bills can't even make it to the floor so that we can see some action on it. So what is our responsibility, do you think, for us as people to have a government that reflects these values that we like to think they stand by?
Oh, well, to take that on, first of all, I think people should learn to vote. The United States, incidentally, is a participatory democracy, however imperfect, however, infirm, but it is a participatory democracy. If you turn up a certain number of votes as against your opponents, you win the election, and for a certain number of years, you get to write laws. You get to decide policies, and basically draw lines as to how people live their lives. In 2008, President Obama was elected. Then 2 years after that, he lost control of Congress. Now, I'm not a political scientist, but again, if you're a politician and you have all these wonderful ideals that you want to carry out, but those ideas are diametrically opposed to people in the other political party who control Congress, essentially the channel by which you will bring about those changes, then you're essentially useless. And all the passion that went into the elections in 2008 will eventually become frustration, because now people see that they have a black president, but cops are still shooting people. Police unions are still very, very strong. Nobody's is holding dirty cops to account. And then you're looking at the White House, okay, but I've got a black president. Now, if you don't take your time to analyze the dynamics and you explain it to people, they will not understand that sometimes the most important election is not the one for the guy at the top, but it's the one for those in Congress. And so if you are going to turn up to vote in the presidential election, perhaps you should turn up more to vote in the legislative elections, especially or including at the state and county levels, where I have discovered during the period I've stayed here in the United States that some of these policies, because many of the police departments are local. These are local, but some of them are tied to cities, some are even tied to universities, So most of the laws governing their operations are drawn at the local level. So you cannot disconnect. The job of the activists, and we've done a lot of work in that area, especially in these last elections, to warn people, the perfect cannot be the enemy of the good. All right. Now, I would define myself as a revolutionary. If you give me the platform, I would like to change everything in this world to be exactly the way I want it. But I also understand that there are contending forces whose responsibility or whose job it is to prevent me from doing just that. So it means that I'm going to keep pushing inch by inch and try to see how much concessions I'll keep getting to make people's lives better. So you do not disengage from the electoral process. You do not disengage from the political process. You do not get disoriented, disenchanted, and frustrated, and then you leave it to your opponents. If you do that, what you're going to have, and this is with apologies to supporters of the current president of the United States, but what you're going to have is that somebody like the now impeached Trump is going to get elected. He's going to roll back, policies that those of us who belong to the other side of the aisle consider, quite progressive, and then you're going to have to start from the scratch. All right, I was reading an article this morning about the damage that Mike Pompeo, who is the Secretary of State, how they've been sowing some sort of landmines to prevent the incoming Biden administration from carrying out some policies to better people's lives. And that's what happens in politics. Now, they're doing all of that so that for the next 4 years, the new administration will have to grapple with quite a number of things and become unpopular. And then when you go to the polls, they'll have a lot of things to tell people about. But if you vote with the same vigor, all right, if in the next 2 years, in the congressional elections, you vote with the same vigor and energy and excitement that you voted this time around, you're going to control the House, you're going to control the Senate, you're going to control the legislative assemblies, and then you're going to write these laws. Police unions are just so powerful. I was reading an article just before this session, and it was reported that 98% of all police-involved shootings are classified by the various departments as justified. And why is that so? Because the departments have the ability to make that classification. So they basically judge themselves. They decide when they've done wrong and when they haven't done wrong. Now, that's too much power. And why is that so? Because the laws allow that. If you go to some of the statutes at both the state and county levels governing these operations, you're going to see enabling statutes or enabling laws allowing the police officers to do that. When the young 17-year-old man was killed here in Pittsburgh, and I apologize because I forget his name. Is that Antoine? I hope I recall the name.
Antoine Rose.
Yeah. Antoine Rose. Yeah, that's Antoine Rose. Now, when he was killed, I mean, there was outrage. Even within some police departments, people felt, okay, look, even if he was running away, posing no threat to the police officer, all right, the reasonable force doctrine shouldn't apply. But then some others argued that there's a provision within the law that the police officer should emphasize not just a threat to himself, but a threat to the larger society from the individual who was running away. So while the young man was making an escape, and the police officer could have called for backup, done any other thing to try and get him arrested, he just easily pulled up the gun and shot at him. Why? Because it's written there that if you did that, you'll get away, with that. So those are the things that you should seek to change. You shouldn't just try to, get people to get involved, but politics is very important. I cannot emphasize that enough. You've got to vote and you've got to run for office, and then you start to see changes happen.
Yeah, I think I would add that we can't just pay attention to national politics and who's in Congress and who has control of the Senate, who has control of the presidency, but I think we really need to pay attention to local politics, especially in Pittsburgh, and look at the Pittsburgh police budgets. And I know I saw a report earlier this year about all of these misdemeanors that all these Pittsburgh police officers had against them, and none of them were being fired. And early in the year, there was an incident at the Squirrel Hill Farmers Market, and I live in Squirrel Hill. And this police officer had many counts of misdemeanors in the past, and he'd had a lot of incidents and nothing had happened to him. And he actually did get fired, and I'm glad that he got fired, because I don't think someone who's made so many mistakes on the police force should still be in their role. But I don't think he should have been able to act that way in the first place. And I think definitely in the past 4 years, a lot of police officers have felt confident to act in ways that they have, and think that they're better than regular citizens in some way, which definitely takes away from their core role, which is supposed to be to protect everyday citizens. And I think adding on to that, we should be placing pressure on our local politicians to be adding more social workers into our police forces, because obviously police cannot help people emotionally in the ways that they can help them physically. And we need to be communicating to our local politicians as well as our national politicians. But I think when it comes to policing, local politics is really what affects us most.
Hey, this is Dustin. Ashley, could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, so my question was, what is our responsibility to shape our government when it comes down to policies, and policies that don't make it through to fix the issues of police officers abusing their power? So keeping track of officers who are having repetitive instances of abusing their power. What's our responsibility to make sure that those decisions get put into law? Those policies, the use of force bills, those type of things that we know need to happen, and we hear our legislators talk about writing their bills, but they sit because we don't move our local state legislature outside of a GOP ran state house or Senate. So what's our responsibility? How do we work with them?
Thank you. Thank you for repeating that. I think one of the things is we need a critical mass amount of people to actually oppose what is happening and what has been happening. Although we have a dominant two-party system who are in opposition on a few things. Like one thing that they have been lock and step on is militarism, is policing, not only happening in the US, but doing that abroad, namely in the global South. So it's important that we're clear on where legislators have historically stood on policing and what they believe to be upholding the social order that they are also in office to uphold as well, right? So we're not gonna ask oppressors to stop oppressing us, right? We need to be able to organize ourselves in a way that we're able to create safety in our communities first, and then we push for the type of things that will decrease the proliferation of police and prisons throughout our communities. I'm thinking of legislators as people that can push for and reparations for people that have survived police violence. Thinking about legislators, and a lot of this has to go with the unions, like Ani mentioned. The police unions are not typical unions. And they're situated as such as typical unions when they should not be treated that way. They are not like a labor union. They are a lobbying force that has lobbied for the police and protected the police from any type of accountability and allowed and justified the violence that they've inflicted upon communities. So I think legislatively, we can undo the how they're located within our systems, right? And then we can begin to push for things like personal liability coverage for every officer that, so when they do enact some form of violence, that they're personally liable for that. Cities shouldn't be paying that out for officer misconduct, which is literally just a budget line across the nation in every city because they know it's going to happen. Need to push for civilian review boards that actually have power to investigate and fire officers. Civilian review boards that don't have the power to fire officers, to discipline them, to investigate them, are just propping up the very same system. Like legislation to disarm the police. This is big on the state and the federal level. A lot of programs, especially under Obama again, some of the programs that came down equipped local police departments with the military equipment that we see them downtown Pittsburgh coming out to protesters with that military equipment gear. We've seen it in St. Louis or in Ferguson after officer killed Mike Brown. And then also on the state level, just complete data transparency. So to have budgets all the way open, to have what weapons they're getting all the way open, to have what training programs and who they're training with all the way open for people to see it. And one of the things I will mention is the to not think about policing in the harms of policing only being murder and killing. I think when we do that, we erase like the very real ways in which they inflict violence upon communities on a daily basis. And to think about how intertwined they are into the fabric of our daily lives, whether it's through the mandated reporter system. So the next step, right, from a teacher or administrator at a school is the police, the child welfare system, which Dorothy Roberts calls the family regulation system. They're intertwined into that. They're a part of almost all of our social programs. And when reforms are offered, they're oftentimes offered to increase that proliferation. So they're saying that we need more officers to go to the barber shop and talk to kids, right? We're saying we need officers to be able to throw a football with kids, to get to learn the neighborhood. All of that just requires them to be more present. The more present police are the more instances of violence that we have. And that's not me just like speaking like, you know, in esoteric terms. Like, these are literal historical facts. Without the police, then we don't have police violence, right?
Valid points, Dustin. So, you know, we have a few questions, and I think a lot of times when we discuss the point of defunding our police, and what we know with defunding police is moving the money to the places that it needs to go to. Everyone has a thought that defund the police is just like, you know, today there's officers, tomorrow there's not. We know that in real life it's not going to happen that quickly, but can you talk about what that actual idea is when we talk about defund the police, and when the funds are put into the places that they're needed to be to support the communities that the tax dollars are coming from? What does that look like? What is the other side of what we look at police now, and if we had you know, something that wasn't harmful?
Yeah, this is Dustin. Maybe I can start off and be brief with this. I would direct folks to, there's a person named Mariam Kaba, that's Kaba, wrote an article in New York Times this summer called "Yes, We Literally Mean Abolish the Police." So to think about what we put money into, like, typically I work with a lot of young people, and when we get together and say like, hey, what do you need or what do you envision for the future? It's almost never police or prisons. They always talk about some form of housing, some type of food, some type of activity, some type of vehicle. All of those things are what money could go into, right? Like right now, I think the city of Pittsburgh spends about a quarter of the budget on policing. And that's not counting the 136 or around 135 police departments that exist within Allegheny County that are not the Pittsburgh police. So we spend a massive amount of money on like social control and policing, where that money can be diverted to so many different places. Housing, when we talk about housing, not only just affordable and accessible housing, but literal free housing, right? When we talk about food, not to understand that we have food apartheid, but then to think about the reasons why the food apartheid exists in the neighborhoods that it does. When we think about Pittsburgh specifically, or the whole region, the amount of pollution that we have, like, what does it take to undo that, right? What does it take to detoxify the land and detoxify the air?
All right, now if I could step in there. Now, basically, what essentially is the police as a structure in society, a constituted body of individuals empowered to enforce laws enacted by the state. And then you go a little bit further, you find out what are laws. Laws are essentially a reflection of the views, the opinions, the proclivities, the interests of the controlling classes within society. That's what laws are. And that's why here in the United States, I find it a little bit amusing that there's this massive debate as to whether you should give the American people $2,000 as aid during the pandemic. But I think in 2017, the same Congress passed tax reduction for corporations running into trillions of dollars. Now, that is the only example you need to know, or you need to see to understand exactly how laws work. Laws work for the controlling interests and classes within society. And it is these laws that police forces are essentially established to uphold. So when you speak about defunding the police, the whole noise, the whole hullabaloo is a product of a misunderstanding, essentially, of what that entails. People suddenly run into a fit. What would life be like without the police force? Now, nobody is thinking about reimagining society. The idea that sometimes people do not trend towards criminality because they are born criminals or they are genetically disposed to criminality. People trend towards that because of the first fundamental law of nature, survival. So if somebody is hungry and they need food and they are faced with the choice of starvation and stealing, they're going to steal. And if they live in a massively materialistic society where the acquisition and possession of material things, flashy, ephemeral possessions, are more like a religion, they are even under more pressure, all right, to be able to get those things. So if they cannot get those things through means that have been defined by society as legitimate, then they're going to find other means outside the law to try to get those things. And it is because the society has failed to address that core question, the fundamental economic question behind why communities trend towards criminality, that they've chosen the opposite. So politicians prefer to spend a quarter of the budget to arm the police, rather than spending a quarter of the budget to economically empower people, place people on basic incomes. All right. Now, while I will be a little bit slow to go further into the politics of that, I think it's a little bit intricate. The idea of defunding the police, and there's been a lot of debates around that. Now, I do not find it as unsettling as a number of. Now, it may not be a catchy phrase to win an election, but it is certainly a forceful enough expression to be able to jolt policymakers into rethinking the role of police in society. Policemen and women themselves aren't removed from the societies that they're supposed to police. They are a function of that society. And this will lead me to an example from Nigeria. The pressures of existence, the core existential questions, all right, food, housing, clothing, healthcare, education, they touch on the police officer as they touch on all other citizens. So in Nigeria and the rest of the third world, for example, where they are very poorly paid, but they are very, very powerful. They are armed. They have the right to take your life and use the concept of reasonable force to defend their actions. You don't pay them, but you arm them. They have an incentive now to monetize the arms that you've given to them. So what are they going to do? They're going to find a way to create a system, a very corrupt system at that, to survive with the powers that they have. And that's what you see in the third world. Now, I mentioned an instance here some time ago, I think at one of the previous conversations I had, when I went to a police station in Nigeria to represent a client of mine whose rights had been violated. He was tortured, and they basically tied both of his hands, and they stopped blood flow because they accused him of smoking pot, Indian hemp, or what you call marijuana here, and they tied both of his hands, stopped blood flow, and both limbs were going to get paralyzed. So we tried to get him out. Now, while I was doing that, I found a set of other young people who had been similarly arrested for the same reasons, and they were going to be tortured to self-incriminate, and then they would be forced to pay huge sums of money to be able to get out of that. So I went beyond representing my client, and I started basically out of public concern. I went into the cases of those other individuals. Now, the police officers were so livid at the fact that I dared to enter representation for those ones that I just met there, and I was to prevent them from making money from those very poor individuals, that they threatened to shoot me at the police station. And events after that incident, basically posed me against, the state, to the point where they burgled my house, physically attacked me, and I had to, basically run away from the place. Now, what is the point I'm trying to make? That the structure of society, which economically skews people's existence, puts them under immense pressure, all right, then push people into criminality, so that rather than solve that problem, you have to create a police force to stop the criminals, on one hand. Then on the second hand, the fact that many of the police officers themselves are very poorly paid. They are under immense pressure to also survive. And sometimes they have an economic incentive to abuse the powers that they have. When you combine that, you have a very terrible mix. And if you consider these two lines of argument, then you start to see that the idea of defunding the police, taking funds away from the forceful orientation, or the orientation of the police towards the use of force as the sole, or at least one of the most prominent tools for social control, and moving those resources into re-engineering society, politically and economically now, empowering people, improving the standard of living of those same police officers, a better house, better education, and then spending money on increasing their interaction and communication with the community that they represent. That goes a very long way. And I read one of the questions on the platform. Somebody said, okay, how do you defund the police? And how do you balance that with, calling the police if you're distressed? So defunding, as I understand it, and as I've read some of the proponents argue, does not entail essentially stopping some sort of structural response to criminality or protection of neighborhoods. It means do not over-militarize, do not excessively resource police force, all right, to the extent that the core issues within society are ignored. Take significant funding. The police force, the police departments do not need armored tankers. They do not need some of the very expensive toys that they parade during protests. They don't need those. Take the funding for those away and channel those into education, channel those into healthcare, channel those into creation or skill acquisition centers where young people are trained to acquire skills that they would need to survive. Now, if you do that, you're going to need less policemen, because those who would ordinarily take to criminality will have a sustainable way to take care of their lives, and then you start to solve that problem. So I think it is not a choice between one or the other. I think we can find that delicate balance, all right, that meets the society's need for some sort of protection against deviant behavior, all right, and the needs to prevent police officers from becoming a menace to the societies they're supposed to protect.
Yeah, I think when I think of defunding the police, I more so think about it as expanding the police, because they have such a large role in our society to respond to massively different things, from like marijuana possession to a mass shooting. And I don't think that we can we can't hold them accountable to protect us from these small things to these large scale attacks. And I think adding to that, if we don't want police to be using like military grade weapons, we should also be getting these weapons out of the hands of like white supremacists, so that we don't have to worry about police responding to these mass killings. And so we can focus more on police having specific roles instead of this large role of protecting everyone, when there are so many different kinds of reasons people call police in our society. And yeah.
So, I feel like in all these conversations, we are ultimately reiterating what does public safety look like? Because in the response you just mentioned, Ada, about police officers, responding to something here in regards to marijuana possession, which we also could talk about, because now we have folks who are legally, financially benefiting from something like that. So why do we still have even a police response to something that would be considered a misdemeanor, compared to when it's not a police officer, when we need like an EMS, or if we need a therapist, or if we need someone who can just knows how to decompress in a situation. What does it look like to reimagine how we respond to public safety? You know, because there are also folks who don't feel when something happens, calling the police isn't their first want because they don't have a good experience with them. So how do we reimagine public safety? Because I really think it's much bigger than just discussing police. And Ani, when you brought up just people's economic status, you know, and being able to have just the things that they need, that will also minimize the need for response to crime, because if people have what they need, they're not committing what we consider crimes. So just, I want to hear your thoughts on when we reimagine public safety and making sure everyone has what they need. What do you see?
Well, community policing, I'm a very strong advocate for that. I do think that in a civilized society, and I don't think we find that the exact meaning of that term in most societies, the level of violence and barbarism in contemporary society falls below the standard of civilization, what true civilization should mean. But I think in a truly civilized society, you can have community policing. And in the last conversation we had, I tried to explain that that means the community protects itself. You're not going to recruit some, external body different from that community. Sometimes loathful of that community to come protect the community. The community will basically draw from its own members in order to serve its security needs. And again, I go back to the third world. Ironically, as a result of the failure of governance in developing countries, Nigeria as an instance, and you got massive insecurity in parts of the country, many Nigerian communities are having a very interesting experimentation with this idea. Now, because they cannot rely on the Nigerian police, which is massively underfunded and very poorly trained and given to corruption and abuse of power. So sometimes their first impulse when they face a security threat is not to pick up the phone and dial the Nigerian police. They try to see how, as a community, they can respond, and that was what led them to the idea of community policing. They would basically pick an adult male or a very an adult female in each family, for families that are interested. All right, and these adult males and adult females will form a unit for the community. All right, and they will draw up a roster for patrols, and based, of course, on their conveniences and their own schedules. Now, maintaining them is their maintenance is pulled directly from funding from within the community, and in return for these, they get tax exemption. So the taxation that members of the community were supposed to pay to certain government agencies would be forfeit, so that they can then revert that funding to that community policing agency. Now, what's the advantage of this system? Like I explained, when you police yourself, you do not harm yourself. All right. If the members of the community, or at least certain members drawn from within the community, are given the responsibility to try and protect the community, they have a knowledge of the community. All right. It means they understand the nooks and crannies. If they want to chase down someone who's committed a crime, it comes very easily to them. All right. Then they cannot abuse themselves. They don't need to suspect, harass, or lord it over themselves, as some policemen want to do when they go into communities to which they do not belong. Number three, they have a reputation to protect. All right, every member of the community knows, the other person, and if you're perceived as a good person, you want to maintain, that reputation as you discharge your responsibility within that community force. Now, I do think that going forward, I think a lot of societies are going to start considering that idea, that the best way for a community to protect itself is to draw up from within itself a group of individuals whose primary motive is not to forcefully suppress individuals within itself, but to guard against defiant behavior and to make sure that every other person is safe. That is my conception of how policing should be done going forward. And one more thing, if you do that, that frees up significant chunk of resources, to be able to address some of the other social problems that we've identified. You don't really have to maintain, and I know that police departments now are a form of employment for a number of people. People go there to look for jobs, not really because they want to be police officers, but because they want to pay their bills. So there's also an economic factor there. All right, but with the community policing model, you don't really have, separate police departments that you have to maintain with taxpayers' funds. All right, so you're going to free up resources that you can channel to other parts of the society to start addressing the core roots of criminality in the first place.
This is Dustin. I do want to mention that, like, even the language of community policing, like, it has a history and it means something. And the way in which it's been deployed to expand the police is like very important understanding that we should have. It's not a coincidence that in like the flames or the ashes of uprisings is when community policing has been touted as the reform, as the solution to what has happened in times where people are hyper aware of police violence. And this has happened for generations now. I'm thinking just dating early back to the 60s. Like, this is how we get the expansion of police into communities under the guise of community policing, under the guise that if police live amongst the people that they police, then somehow they are less likely to commit violence. That undermines everything we know to be true about policing. We know that police officers themselves have the highest rates of intimate partner violence out of any other group that we have data on, right? We know that police officers themselves are purveyors of sexual violence in many different ways. So we're inviting people into our community that are actually like perpetuating the same things we claim that we want to get rid of. It's been used to like displace problems, right? Like the occupation of police in certain neighborhoods or territories. It'll displace whatever we view to be crime from happening, but it'll move somewhere else. Like in Pittsburgh, the police do something called like hotspot and hot zone policing, where they pick a block, they go there. All it does is move activity somewhere else. And that's been a tool for gentrification in Pittsburgh.
If I may clarify very quickly, Dustin.
Yeah.
I think I totally understand the point being made, but maybe I wasn't very clear initially. The concept I'm explaining is, I think, a bit different from the idea of having police officers live within the community. I think that's different. Or maybe I should give a little bit of information about the structural nature of the communities where these have been practiced. In the United States, you have like a melting pot. So you don't have like tribes and ethnicities, and I mean, not in the way you would have them in developing countries. So in Nigeria, if you were speaking of a community, you're speaking essentially of a largely homogeneous individuals. Now, you may have strangers who are not part of the community living amongst them. So when they speak of community policing in that sense, they're talking of people who are members of the community protecting themselves. They're not speaking of police officers coming to live in the community and then acting as if they are part of the community. They are responding to the security needs of their community by tasking the adult members of the community to provide that security. All right. So it's more like if you could protect your house, and we have 10 houses in the neighborhood, and each father in the house or each mother in the house could provide security. Now, instead of doing it as individuals, why not let's pull that unit together, and then we form a structure that protects all the 10 houses so that we're stronger. That's the concept. And I'm not going to be naive as to suggest that, yes, you're not going to have instances of maybe abuse in any human structure. But I think if you're going to evolve from the completely failed structure that we have right now, since of course you cannot eliminate crime overnight, and I have made the economic argument for criminality, but if you're going to transition into that structure that serves the dual need of protecting the community without abusing the members of that community, I am very deeply convinced that that approach will be a very good place to start.
This is Dustin, and I'll be brief. I just like I think that we should like be in continuous interrogation of not only the police and what function they have in the society as we know it, but also the police that live within us too, right? The cops that are in our head, and to interrogate like why like we view the police to be a permanent fixture of society. Like even the language of policing within and of itself, right? Like this is not something that has always existed. As far as the time continuum of humans, the police are a very new feature. Like this is not something that has always been necessary. And we should really think about the amount of messaging that we've received about the police, about what function they play in society, where it comes from, the amount of TV shows, the amount of times they came to your school to visit you, like all of the times in which they told us that the police are there to do good in communities, right? Like all of this could be viewed as propaganda. And then we should move accordingly to that, right? I think about even like the language of first responder. Like I know that wherever I've lived, the first people to respond are never the police. It's always somebody in my household. It's somebody on the street. It's somebody in my neighborhood. It could have been a teacher at times. But we say the language that the police are somehow the first to respond to this, and what we do is erase all the ways in which community is already showing up for each other. So one of the things we think about is like, oh, what would happen if the police weren't there? In some neighborhoods, the police don't come there. They don't respond to calls when it is for intra-community violence. So we know what happens. We know what happens when the police are not there, or people that have committed sexual assault don't go to prison, because the majority of people that have committed sexual assault don't go to prison. Like, so we already know what some of these things are. What I guess like the question of abolition, what it challenges is like, what can we do about it, right? Outside of just saying that we need more police. That doesn't necessarily solve the issues, and it's been proven not to solve those issues. So I just think like a deep interrogation also of the people that we want the police to handle as well. Oftentimes it's Black people, young Black people. And then it's also not a coincidence that the majority of people that are in jails, prisons, and murdered by the police are disabled people. These are folks that we're deeply uncomfortable with to walk past on the street, right? Like this is not something that just exists now. It's existed post-Civil War, when city ordinances passed a bunch of Black codes, a bunch of ugly laws to say that anybody that's maimed or dismembered should be off the street. We have entire institutions set up for them still to this day. And the prisons are also serving as a de facto place to move the people we're uncomfortable with, right? So even in Pittsburgh now, when we have games at Pitt, the Pittsburgh police do sweeps of the area, the upper hill to get rid of people that don't have houses. A couple of years ago, we had council members arguing over where they're gonna put homeless encampments, right? Like these are all functions in which police play in society, but a lot of it has to do with who we're uncomfortable with. Fearful of young Black people just gathering and assembling and deliberating. And I would argue, earlier we talked about democracy, like we don't have a working democracy in the United States, and we never have had that. There are people that legally cannot vote for a bunch of different reasons, whether it's guardianship, whether they're in prison, whether people have felonies, and so on and so forth.
Ada, I think you had wanted to say something, so I wanted to make sure.
Oh, I was just going to add to a point that Dustin made about how the Pittsburgh police kind of hotspots certain neighborhoods. And I think that also kind of leads to this over-policing, which just perpetuates even more violence. And
yes, I agree. And I want to say it may have been Dustin that brought up this point, but you know, that's why when I asked my question, it was more geared towards public safety, you know, from the point of who is the real first responder, who is actually equipped when an emergency happens in anyone's life, who is the one that is, what are those answers, I guess, to get to the solution of helping and supporting whatever someone's need may be. And the levels of policing, like we discussed, if we're on a college campus, you have your college campus police, then you have your city police, and then you have your county police, and then you have your state police. I mean, within one neighborhood, that's 4 layers of policing. And, is that necessary? From all of our conversation today, I would think that we agree that it's not necessary. And that's how defunding the police can look differently, because why do we need to have 5 different police forces in this one particular area? So it is about 6:30, and we do have a few questions that have been shared from our audience that we have. So here's a question. So whenever we have protests that happen and we have riots that are businesses or destruction of businesses around the country, and it's caused by citizens of the US, how would you control that without police officers?
All right. If I could answer that, I remember during the last protests on the death of George Floyd, there were a lot of concerns as to the destruction of property, and I wrote a piece on Facebook, and I told people, somebody wrote the killing of George Floyd was bad, but they shouldn't destroy properties. And I caution that no, you should state it the other way. The destruction of properties is bad, but you shouldn't kill unarmed black men. You have to place the emphasis on the killing of unarmed black people. Now, as somebody who has a history of protests, I was a student leader back in Nigeria, and we had a lot of protests actually to try and keep tuition fees. You guys don't have that system here in America, but Nigerian universities, they're allowed to raise tuition fees to fund themselves. And usually for every year that tuition is raised, a mass of students are pushed out of school who cannot pay. So as student activists, it was our role to ensure that for people to stay in school, you just didn't raise those fees. And if you raise those fees, we would protest until you reverse the fees and kept people in school. Now, we did try to ensure that we didn't have vandalism and destruction of property in the course of the protests. But what is true is that in every expression of mass anger, all right, you're going to have anarchists, you're going to have those we call agents provocateurs, sometimes state agents planted within the protest itself, to try and essentially take the destructive path in order to morally blackmail or create a path to morally blackmail those protests. So if the question is, what do you do when people start to destroy properties? I would advise that we'll go back to what do you do to stop people from protesting in the first place? Because you will never have a guarantee that properties are not going to be destroyed when people turn out and start protesting. And you're going to have a mass of people, maybe 99% of individuals who are just there to express their anger. They have no business touching those properties. Right? But since we cannot police everyone at the protest and we cannot read to their intentions, unfortunately, things are going to get damaged. And that's why we say, go back to it, make sure that you don't step on the neck of a black person, and when they beg you to stop, you put your neck there until they stop breathing and they're killed. Now, make sure that when you see another human being, whether they are black or white, all right, even if you suspect that they're criminal, make sure you try to de-escalate before you pull out your gun and you shoot them, all right? Make sure that you use all levers of human compassion, human interaction, civilized human behavior to treat other human beings, even if you're wearing uniform. Because we can guarantee that when you do that, there will be peace. What cannot be guaranteed is what happens when you kill a young person or an old person who shouldn't have died, and then people turn out to protest that killing. Now, let me make one more point. Human societies are imperfect, all right? That usually I would argue that sometimes humanity is a disappointment. With all the talents that we have, we could create something much better than this, but this is what we have. Now, there are those of us who are campaigning for a transition to something that is better. We feel that you could have a society that is decent, that caters to all of its members, their economic and social, well-being, so that you do not have incentives to criminality. And like somebody argued, you basically phase out, the police force. But as we have it right now, all right, that process is going to be transitory, all right, except you have an all-embracing revolution that basically, flushes the existing structures, all right, and builds new structures overnight. And I don't know the feasibility of that. You're definitely going to have to pass through a phase. And it does happen that in passing through that phase, as you are pushing forward your ideas, there will be those on the other side who are, for good or for bad, are entitled to believe things completely separate or completely, different from what you believe, who are going to try and push back on your attempts to try and change society. Now, since you are not going to pull your gun and kill them or try to shoot them, you are going to continue to persist on that incremental work, all right, of breaking down the current structures and then setting up the structures that can lead to a more equitable arrangement within society. And it is on that basis that I would advise that for strategic purposes, because our roles as activists is not just to condemn and pick out the problems and basically point it out to society. It's also our responsibility to point feasible solutions that you can start to put in place and start to change people's lives. And that's why we started to suggest some of the ideas where these are not the final point. That's not where we intend to stop. All right, but we think that will be a bridge to the future that we'll seek.
Do you need me to does anyone want me to repeat that question, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways when we have police at like these protests and riots, it exacerbates the problem at hand even more when police are kind of used as these political props, which I think we saw this summer, even when police cleared the way so our president could go take a picture in the middle of a protest. And I don't think we would have seen that at last week's riot. And I think that we can't really have these double standards when it comes to policing different protests, which was very obvious last week.
Yeah, this is Dustin. I think this question just makes me think of like the James Baldwin interview where he says he objects to the term looters and then poses the question, whom is looting who? And then also just like on a surface level, not to be like, I guess rude here, but I'm just, without the police killing somebody, then there would be no protest to the police killing someone.
Thank you. So there was another question. So someone asked, what do you do in insular communities that seek to harm others? In a community where racism is the norm and is celebrated, what is the responsibility of wider society to change that? Police officers now aren't plucked from thin air. They are also members of the community that have been radicalized by their power and responsibility.
Well, again, I made the point earlier that, yeah, policemen and women do not exist in a vacuum. They are products of the general society. If you want to address insularity or the conduct of police officers in an insular society, essentially a racist one at that, maybe looking at the police force isn't where to start. Now, when I came here, I mentioned this the last time. I out of curiosity, because I wanted to understand how so-called, middle-aged uneducated white men. That's not a description I like to use, but incidentally, it's a description that is there because sometimes these are ordinary people. Many of them are poor. They are who they are because society made them that way. But again, I joined a volunteer fire department, which to my mind was a mirror of many police departments. Because as a matter of fact, some of the members of that fire department were also police officers. So you basically could draw a connection from one to the other. Because I wanted to understand the thought process. And I was basically awestruck to discover that many of these people had never had interactions with people who don't look like them. As a matter of fact, now I was a lawyer. It wasn't a paid position. It was on my time. All right. I have family responsibilities to attend to, but I wanted to make time to be able to serve the community and then to be able to interact and understand these people's worldview. But many of them felt that I was a usurper. Some black dude who came in here, got some master's degree, shouldn't be in this police department, shouldn't be in this fire department. All right. And you saw this hostility. And at the risk of sounding a little bit conceited, I am quite a personable individual. I mean, if you stay with me, you wouldn't find a lot of reasons to have problems with me. But that was what I discovered. All right. And that was because the society in which they lived had groomed them to feel that way. I also sense that they felt threatened. And this is a very important point to make. They felt this right-wing talk that they are getting replaced. Maybe my presence there would mean some of them losing their position there. Maybe a sea of black people will, flood into the place and take over the department. The best way to address those concerns, if you're not going to start a war, because race and religion are two very passionate factors that can drive people to extreme levels of violence. Now, if you're not going to start a war to resolve that question, a war that eventually would not end, the best way to address that would be to have a facilitated conversation across these communities. The concept of insularity itself is even promoted by law. The idea of redlining, where the system prevents people of color from buying property or living in certain neighborhoods, so that at the end of the day, you have a set of just white people living in those areas, and then you have another community with maybe all black people living in those areas. Now, such insularity is also promoted by law. So if you attack or if you try to change those laws and you mix people up, that's what you should do. Not everyone will go to a university, but people could meet at the mall, people could meet at clubs, people could meet at the local fire department, people could have interactions, people could have community forums. All right. When you try to facilitate these levels of conversation so that people can understand themselves, then you start to solve that problem. One final point, please. In the United States, politicians, just like politicians in other parts of the world, they seem to have this terrible incentive to divide people. It does seem very shocking that for you to win an election, you have to make enemies of certain individuals while embracing other people. All right. So if I'm a Republican, I need to sound like I support the police. Like I can give the police a blanket check. Whatever the police officer does, the police are always right. And I'm against the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, if I'm a liberal, I should probably sound like, maybe not all liberals do this, but I should probably sound like, okay, I'm all for, racial justice, and I'm against the police violence. And this is not true. All right. You can totally support and defend the rights of people of color in this country to exist and not be visited with violence, while also identifying the fact that many of the police officers in these police departments are themselves victims of the system that bred them. All right. And while we seek, a system of accountability that prevents them from going against people of color, we must ensure that politicians are not encouraged to drive a wedge of division amongst the population and basically throw everybody off course.
Any other points to that question in regards to how do we, I think for me, That's a question that I personally just ask myself, when we talk about, our state level government and gerrymandering and how certain communities are able to withhold a certain mindset and a certain type of person that is created. Even when we talk about our current president, Donald Trump was created over the years of all the problems that this country has always had when it comes to white supremacy. So I guess in the question of what is the responsibility of us as a community to change that dynamic, is that activating more people? Is that having conversations, going into those communities and having conversations? Maybe it can't be someone that doesn't look like them, but how does that work begin? What does that look like?
This is Dustin. Ada, do you want to respond first?
You can. I mean, I think my answer would be we start with voting, but I think I know we do live in a broken democracy. I mean, not totally broken, but we can't totally rely on voting and getting politicians into office that we support to solve these issues. I mean, as you said, Donald Trump has not just been in our country for the past 4 years. I mean, he's been built up for the past decade and even more than that. So I think we can definitely start with voting and start with being civically engaged and paying attention to not just our national politics, but our local politics. But I definitely think we need to do more than just voting. And I'm not totally sure I know the answer to that.
Thank you.
This is Dustin. I think like earlier I said we need a critical mass of people to oppose what is happening right now. And I seen like a question about that in the chat too. And I'm thinking more in lines of what we see on a national level. We see the rise of the far right. We see fascism being enacted. We see a coup that hasn't just been like this past week, but it's been months, extending months. Whether it's failed or not, it's still a coup, right? So to oppose fascism and let people know it's not okay is, I feel, very important. This is not something that's just happening in the US. Far right governments have risen to the top in France with Le Pen, or Netanyahu in Israel, or Bolsonaro in Brazil. Like, this is something that is happening on a global scale. And it's a really important time for us to be out in the streets and protesting. And I'm saying this with all understandings of what that means in the middle of a pandemic in which disabled people are rapidly dying, right? In a time in a pandemic where 75% of the deaths from COVID are people that are in nursing facilities or connected to nursing facilities. So I say that with that level of importance, that people actively need to be opposing this in the streets. And a lot of that work has to fall upon white people. White people have to gather other white people around what other white people are doing. White people forever has enacted violence in the US, in the West, right? When we think about who has colonized land, so even like the questions about looting, like we're talking about groups of people that have gained wealth, have gained power through violence, through looting literal people and lands. And now they're asking questions about the destruction of the very property that would not even exist if it weren't for the violence in which they enacted. So when I'm thinking about the work that white people need to do, it's not just like, to join a book club or read like a very bad book, like How to Be an Anti-Racist, right? It is to literally do the work of gathering those people. And that is deep work. It is ancestral healing work. It is providing resources to people that don't have those resources, the redistribution of wealth. It is the understanding that the only reason they're able to actually accumulate what they have is through the violence particularly squarely situated on Black and indigenous bodies, at least in the US context?
The solution is economic. And Dustin's last point is one I'm going to just flesh out. Does it not strike you that those who support Donald Trump the most are essentially found in trailer parks? They are some of the poorest sections of white society. And yes, this is not to pretend like I think Donald Trump got, I think about what, 6 to 9% of the Black votes, especially Black men. So it's not like it's an isolated situation, but it's to make the point that there is a hidden economic plank to all of this. Now, if you, and we've heard this over and over, if you cannot explain to the man why he's poor, or you don't want him to see that his poverty is directly linked to your exploitative policies, then you seek to convince him that his skin color sort of makes him superior to the other person. And if you've built this false ideology across several generations, breaking it becomes a problem. And that's why, since it has an economic foundation, the solution has to be economic. And that's why, yes, to Dustin's point, you've got to redistribute wealth. And any mention of that is described in this society as socialism. And like Dr. King pointed out, there is actually socialism in America. People know that, all right? As a lawyer, I see when companies or corporations can't pay their debt, they declare bankruptcy, and then they are protected, all right? Now, for those that have in their employ large numbers of people, they are bailed out by the state. When you bail out, you literally take public money and you put it into the private pockets of these companies. Now, under the guise that they're going to repay. But that is socialism, essentially. That's what it is. And then when you talk of tax cuts, because from a political, economic, or socio-political economic perspective, what the holders of wealth or the hoarders of wealth in American society do is to blackmail every American government. If you tax us too much, we're not going to make the investment needed to create jobs. Unemployment will go up. People are going to blame you, and then they're going to kick you out of office. And it's a system that's worked for quite a while. But I believe that you could institute a system that compels them, all right, to channel a significant quantity of a significant portion of the wealth that they have hoarded, built by workers, both Black and white workers, poor workers, all right, into changing the lives of these people. And I think that if the poor white population has access to education, has access to healthcare, has access to a social trajectory to the top, like every other person in the population, it's going to be a very difficult proposition to put across to them that the foreigner, the Black person, the Muslim, the Jew is responsible for their plight in life. So the solution is economic. You've got to redistribute wealth. There's no doubt about that.
All right. Thank you so much for that. So we are wrapping up and getting to the end. So I do want to allow each of you just a few moments if you wanted to share any last thoughts with this conversation that we have had today. It has been very rich in different ideas and concepts of what when we talk about policing in this country and how we are going to make sure that our safety isn't binded in the oppression of the majority of people who are just trying to live and survive in this country. So I want to just allow each of you a few moments to maybe give a few parting words, and then we will have Julie Malice give a closing. Thank you.
All right, I started this, so let me end. Strategy is everything. Strategy is everything. And I've lived in societies that are worse from a developmental point of view, if you will, than what you have, and that is not in any way an endorsement of the system that goes on here. But if you have lived in a colonial territory, you would understand that what the imperfection in this system shows you guys is worse. Perhaps we get about 10 times that in that part of the world. And how we've been able to fight this is to ensure that we're not just making demands, but we also put in place strategies to get results. Before now, we used to boycott elections in Nigeria because we didn't trust the credibility of those elections. And we would say, oh, they're going to rig the elections, our votes wouldn't count. And we thought we were going to be able to, pull together the force to basically override the entire system, create a new structure, set up new rules for elections, and then come to power. But my father worked under that arrangement. Nothing happened. Generations after generations suffered. That was a failed strategy. Our generation saw it differently, that we had to get engaged. If we couldn't muster the military force to engage and overturn things, then we're going to engage them with the political system that they have built and seek to defeat them within that system. And it's a very funny proposition, but we've made some very significant progress. And that is what I will propose both here and elsewhere. I spoke earlier about the imperfections of American democracy, but I still think that sometimes when you get people to vote en masse and you run people for those offices, all right, corporate funding will not be enough to skew those elections. If you understand the way elections work, all right, sometimes when you have massive turnout of voters, the ability of individuals to manipulate the polls becomes very difficult. So sometimes they have a pullback. So I will double down on that. You've got to, until at least you are able to evolve or create something different, you have to contest for power under the system. You've got to have people who think like you, making the laws or trying to overturn the existing laws. While you're protesting on the streets, you've got to make sure that you're running candidates for offices at the county, at the city, at the state, and at the national level. If you disengage from politics, that's a very suicidal approach. You're never going to get anything changed.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's productive to recognize the flaws and imperfections, but I think we also can think about the ways in which we have the power to change these systems. And we can't just sit by and critique things, but we need to also take action and be involved.
Yeah, this is Dustin. I'm thinking like right now about like after the insurrection at the Capitol, and is it being like a highlighting how the police don't keep people safe? But it feels very important that our response to that is not to increase the amount of police now and increase the amount of security. We've seen with the CVE program under Obama how when that happens, what it does is marginalize people. That program specifically was used to expand surveillance around Muslims in the US. So I'm thinking about like even the language of terrorist within and of itself, it can't be divorced from what it was deployed for. Used to describe Palestinians, then used to describe under Reagan, people that are in the Middle East, Black and brown people globally, right? So when we use that language, what we're doing is legitimizing the idea that anybody going against the state can then be labeled a terrorist. And that will expand to like we see it happen even in Philly with Ant Smith, somebody that is resisting police violence in Philly on the streets is now facing charges, right? There's people in Pittsburgh from the summer from destroying a police vehicle allegedly that are facing charges. So like when they build prisons, they will fill prisons. When they create a law, they will find a way to fund it, and they will find a way to give us more police. So it's important in these times that we resist that idea that the police are somehow going to keep us safe, because we know they won't. Also, the electoral system, to not look to that as some type of panacea. The amount of energy and the resources that we put into electoral organizing, if that were to go into organizing ourselves and organizing our communities, we would transform the world in a year. But we spend so much energy and resources on electoral organizing when it is in no way ever going to give us freedom, right? That's not to say we shouldn't utilize it as a tool, but we shouldn't put all of our eggs in that basket. And the last thing I'll say is abolition is not this project of absence. It's less about the destruction of prisons and jails and the removal of the police, but more about a project of presence and building and making the world that we want. And that is inviting people into making that world as they want to see it. And there's not one solution, right? Like the immediate response is like, what do we do without the police? It is going to be a set of things that we do without the police over years, over generations. Right now, we have to build the world that we know we will never live in, right? This is the world that are for future generations that we have to build. But it's just important to note that like we'll fail at that. Like we'll try projects and they will fail and violence will happen and things will happen, but that's just what it's gonna take. We have put so much resources into police and prisons and it hasn't worked that I feel like it's our responsibility to do something to try something that might work, right? And also thank y'all for holding this conversation and for the Access team and providing ASL English interpreters.
Thank you all. And now there is Julie.
Hi, everybody. I just want to first start off and say, wow. This is Julie Malice speaking. I am the City Director of Repair the World Pittsburgh, and I'd like to take a moment to share some thank yous and close us out for the night. First, a huge thank you to Dustin, Oni, Ada, Ashley for speaking your truth and allowing for a productive dialogue and brave conversation. Thank you so much to the organizers, Becca, Miracle, Olivia, Brenna, Yvonne, Joe, Dinah Lee, One Hood Media, World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh, and Repair the World Pittsburgh. Special shout out to our interpreters, Catherine and Dan, and to Brittany for framing the conversation in the beginning. A huge thank you to you, all of our attendees, for being part of this event tonight. And lastly, please continue to stay engaged in this work. Follow the organizers for ways you can get involved in showing up for each other and in service. This weekend in particular, Repair the World is hosting learning and service opportunities in the community to honor the life and legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Lastly, again, please check in with your loved ones, friends, neighbors, and families. Signing out, and thanks again. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.